Hello, and welcome to the J of Metro Detroit's 71st Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. My name is Ellen Maisloff, and I'm the Senior Director of the Opening the Doors program at the JCC of Metro Detroit. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to Just Human, the Quest for Disability Wisdom, Respect, and Inclusion with Dr. Arielle Silverman. The J's Opening the Doors program works with schools and health organizations to open the doors of opportunity by providing innovative and individualized services, which enables more than 1,100 students with diverse learning abilities to participate in inclusive Jewish education in their early childhood centers, day school, and congregational school classrooms. Our nationally recognized program also provides psychoeducational evaluations, teen leadership, and community-wide disability and mental health programs for educators, families, and health professionals, which educate, include, and empower. We are celebrating over 70 years of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair and a return to more traditional book fair events in person at the J. To see our full event schedule, watch events you have missed, and browse our online store where you can find Just Human and plenty of other hand-selected books and gifts, visit our website at jccdet.org/bookfair. If you enjoy this event and other book fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to Book Fair. You can do either or both at our website, jccdet.org/bookfair. We rely on community support to make this annual event possible, so thank you in advance for becoming part of the family. And if you would like to find out more about Opening the Doors programs, visit the JCC website at jccdet.org/OTD. I would like to extend our deepest gratitude to the whole Book Fair committee and the Opening the Doors team. Your dedication, innovation, commitment, and hard work make all of this possible. We have a fascinating event for you this evening, and we want you to be part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comment section below or by texting your number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they will take as many questions as they can. While you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. That way, you'll never miss any of the exciting virtual events. The focus of today's event is Just Human, the Quest for Disability Wisdom, Respect, and Inclusion with author Dr. Arielle Silverman. We also have with us Jennifer Finer Lovy, Detroit area journalist, who will moderate the discussion. Arielle Silverman is a disabled activist and a social scientist who is passionate about improving public understandings of life with disabilities. Professionally, she has spent 15 years conducting research on the social psychology of disability. Personally, she has spent a lifetime learning and teaching with fellow members of the disability community. Jennifer Lovy is a Detroit area journalist, writing primarily about parenting, religion, and culture. She is the mother of 3 teenagers and a perpetual advocate for her son with autism. Jen is also a board member of Friendship Circle, a local organization providing programs and services to individuals with special needs. Please join me in welcoming Arielle Silverman.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and thanks to everyone who is taking some time out of their evening to hear more about my book and its message. So, human memory is a funny thing because we often remember random facts that may not have a lot of meaning. We may even hold on to memories that are painful that we wish we could forget. And yet, none of us, at least nobody that I've ever met or talked to, can remember their birth or the first year of their life. And typically, when we do start to remember things from our childhoods, like our early childhoods, we tend to remember them in kind of small snippets or clips of experience rather than a coherent whole. So there are small days, periods, events that can stand out in our memories for the rest of our lives. When I was diagnosed, or rather, when the doctors determined that I had congenital blindness at the age of 5.5 months, the diagnosis, of course, did not come to me. It came to my parents. And I learned of my congenital blindness diagnosis through other people. And of course, my parents had a very different interpretation with their own life experience and feelings and thoughts about disability than I did. My book really reflects on and centers the fact that so first of all, for me, being blind is natural. It's a natural, normal part of life. And early in my life, it never occurred to me that the people around me, my family members, my friends, my teachers, everyone around me, had this other capability that I did not have. I always thought that life was made up of sounds and textures and smells and tastes and thoughts and feelings and sensations. And it never seemed like there was anything missing or absent in that experience. But of course, we know that blindness is characterized in a very different way by much of the rest of society. Some people would even say that blindness is akin to being imprisoned or even being dead. And blindness is one of the most feared conditions that one can have. So much of my life is spent trying to understand why and how something that for me just seems like another part of my body and nothing to really be concerned with has such a different meaning to other people. And I progressed through stages of development, starting with this kind of naive belief that everyone was like me, and puzzling over the fact that my peers and teachers and parents, family members had these abilities that I didn't necessarily have. They could read letters that were flat, whereas I was reading in Braille. They could get around without a white cane. They could throw a ball that didn't make any noise and be able to catch it, and so on. But of course, that naive state did not last forever. And in the book, I reflect on some of these little snippets of experience that stuck around in my mind that have meaning in terms of the broader disability justice landscape. And I write about my initial discovery of racial differences. And then I write about getting to a point of development where I recognize the fact that some people treated me differently because of my disability. So I knew that I was blind and other people weren't. I eventually figured that out. And I figured out that some people treated me differently from my peers, but I had not yet put together that the reason some people treated me differently is because I was blind. And of course, I struggled with figuring out what to do with that information and how to accept myself and be accepted by others for who I was. And sometimes when you think about prejudice and stereotyping, you think about it as kind of a blatant hatred or exclusion. And there were occasional times when I was just flat out excluded from things. But more often, the prejudice is a lot more subtle. And I spend a lot of time writing about it in some detail in the book because I think it's important for people to understand how subtle prejudice that can sometimes even be dressed up as positive interaction can actually cause harm. And so even people's behaviors like being overprotective of me, believing that I would get hurt if I was fully included in activities, came from a positive regard, a desire to be kind and to protect me or to help me. But the result was being excluded or having a sense of not being fully respected and seen as competent. I also write about a phenomenon called inspiration porn, where people would make a big fuss about ordinary achievements that I had, or maybe even slightly extraordinary achievements that I had, were treated as very extraordinary, which again is well intended and can look positive on the surface. But it had these kind of subtle negative effects on my self-esteem and my understanding of myself and where I belonged in the world. So eventually, as I matured, I found a community of blind peers where I was able to get a lot of the affirmation that I was looking for and self acceptance that I was looking for. And each chapter of the book kind of looks at a different event or a different period in that developmental process. In the second half of the book, I talk about my adulthood and some of my career decisions to get a doctorate and do research and learn more about where prejudice and stereotypes come from and why people might have some of the reactions that they have to disability, with the ultimate goal of trying to treat and alleviate those prejudices and stereotypes so that we can promote full equality. I write about some of my experiences going through college, going through a program called the Louisiana Center for the Blind, going through graduate school, meeting my husband, and then starting work as a consultant, working with different organizations. I've worked with some Jewish camps and Union for Reform Judaism and some synagogues. I've also worked with some secular organizations, um, providing trainings and research support, working toward this goal of full inclusion for all. Um, and then I guess kind of the last stage in my development was learning about disabilities that were very different from my own, which I started to do kind of independently as I was working as a disability consultant. I started reading blogs and articles to really try to educate myself about other types of disabilities. And I also worked at a mentoring program for blind youth, but a lot of my students also had autism or intellectual disabilities or other kinds of neurodivergent identities. And I learned a lot about, I thought that I had it hard in terms of the kinds of prejudice that I was subjected to. And I learned a lot of heartbreaking things about how special education in a lot of well meaning but misguided ways can harm people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And the chapters near the end of the book kind of reflect on some of those lessons and some of the parallels between attitudes and behaviors toward people with those types of disabilities and other social justice issues and how they can be remedied. Um, at the end of the book, I reflect on this model that I call the 5 stages of inclusion. And I will say this is a model that I just kind of made up and it doesn't necessarily have a lot of scientific validity, but it's appealing to folks as they think about how to become more inclusive. And so, just in brief, the model goes from stage 1 as being kind of active, what I refer to as active exclusion. So, people who are in stage 1 might feel negative feelings toward people with disabilities. They might shun them. They might try to harm them. They might just, try to avoid them. People have these negative reactions and we all have these negative reactions that we have to overcome. And then stage 2 is more like a neutral stage where we don't really think about disability one way or the other. And, it's better than stage 1 because we're not shunning people, but at the same time, we might not think to make the kinds of accommodations that are required to make spaces more inclusive. Stage 3 is the helping stage, which is like I was talking about earlier. People in stage 3 want to be kind, they want to be helpful, they might feel sorry for the person with a disability, or they might just want to help them, but they do things that still kind of other the disabled person and prevent a full equal relationship. Stage 4, I refer to as the equality stage, and that's the point where people are connecting on more of an equal level and promoting inclusion for the sake of bringing out the talents of that everyone has to offer, including people with disabilities. But stage 4 is limited in that people might not anticipate that people with disabilities are everywhere. So people might focus more on making accommodations for individuals when they're requested, but not necessarily like thinking ahead and anticipating the fact that 1 in 5 individuals has a disability, and at some point, spaces need to be made accessible proactively. And then stage 5, which I refer to as the disability justice stage, is kind of an ideal where people are mindful of kind of the full range of disability access needs and proactively planning for those needs, and also seeing intersections between disability justice and other types of, racial justice and gender equality, class equality, all those different kinds of identities intersecting with one another. So I wrote this book in spurts starting about 5 or 6 years ago. I started jotting down some of these stories, some of these little clips that were sticking around in my mind from childhood. But then when the pandemic happened in 2020, I really felt this sense of urgency. Of course, we were in a state where we didn't know what was going to happen next. I didn't know how much longer my loved ones would be alive. I didn't necessarily know if our routines would be permanently altered. And I wanted to be sure to communicate the kinds of messages about inclusion and acceptance and respect and human dignity that I had learned from my childhood and my work in the inclusion field in various ways. So the book has this kind of backdrop of 2020 where I'm sharing these stories from the past, but then the present day narrator is sitting in 2020 participating in conversations that were happening then in social media about racial issues, for example, or concerns about democracy, concerns about public safety, all those kinds of concerns serve as kind of a backdrop for the book. So before I conclude with my segment, I will give you a little reading from the very end of chapter 17, but it is not a spoiler. It simply kind of ties together the 5 stages of inclusion in with my vision for what I would want the next generation to see. And at the end of this section, it does kind of conveniently foreshadow what you'll be reading about in each chapter. So I thought it would be a good section to share with all of you. And I'm reading from the Braille copy of the book. I'll just briefly hold it up. Believe it or not, this is only half the book because Braille takes up much more space than print does. Stage 5 is meant to be an ideal state of being within a community, a state when all people are equally valued, all identities are positively acknowledged, and all differences are celebrated. Reaching this stage requires effort, creativity, and perseverance. It requires us to actively redirect some of our most basic instincts, the evolved human drive to distance ourselves from others who are not like us or who appear to be a threat. Stage 5 also requires us to dismantle systems of inequality built and reinforced for centuries. In Stage 5, we recognize that, although racism and ableism may have very different consequences, they both originate from a common instinct to favor certain bodies as superior to others. A hallmark of Stage 5 is the awareness of diversity as a strength, not a failing. Though we are still falling far short of Stage 5, we have made tremendous progress over time. This gives me hope we are still capable of progressing further. In June 2020, several of our students graduated from high school. What a strange, unforgettable senior year these students had. On a Zoom call, Melissa shared a video of her virtual graduation. As I watched, I heard the familiar melody of Pomp and Circumstance. This same melody played during my 3 graduations, from high school in 2003, my bachelor's degree in 2007, and my PhD in 2014. The familiar tune transports my mind back to each graduation and their common mood. Each graduation was an end, but also a beginning, a commencement. Each time I heard that song and walked across the stage, I felt the infinite freedom of the future as one chapter ended and a new one began. I felt that sense of open time and space extending ahead and the power to shape it however I wished. I remember riding home from each commencement ceremony, sleeping deeply that night, and waking up the next day feeling a sense of complete freedom to shape the next chapter of my life. We may never graduate from our prejudices, but each of us has the power to shape our own lives, the lives of our loved ones, and the collective path of our communities. We can make things better for the generations who come after us, even if we cannot reverse what has already been done. As I look into the open space of the future and consider my past, I think of my dreams for the young people who will come after me. I dream they will be born into a world where their uniqueness is expected, not a surprise, where their parents will support them to explore their world from the bottom up, where they will greet every can't with a why not, where they will recognize their privilege and use it for good, where they will find good archaeologists and careful people who accept them without reservation, where they will find at least one loyal ally through adversity, where they will find true friends like KJ and teachers who believe in them like Mrs. Gersh, where they will remember that the best years of life have yet to come, where every person's contributions will matter, where they will find the person in whose embrace they feel completely secure, where it's okay to get lost, where they are treated as people with full humanity, ordinary others, and experts on their own needs, where they are empowered to use their big voices and to play to their own beats, where authorities stop, ask, and listen to their needs, where they can stim loud and proud. Somewhere, at this moment, a newborn like me draws their first breath, a person whose body or mind is somehow different from the norm. Like mine, this person's earliest memories will emerge from the stories others tell them. Let us all join together to welcome their birth as an unquestionable gain. Now I will take some questions from Jennifer.
Arielle, thank you so much for sharing your insight and your experiences with us. I really appreciate it. And I love that last passage that you read. That was really powerful and packed with a lot of great emotion. And thanks for sharing it. I wanted to go back and talk a little bit about the 5 stages of inclusion, particularly stage 5. What are some baby steps or first steps that we as a community or a school or a teacher or a parent, what can people do to get towards stage 5 and achieving that?
So that's a great question. I've been giving it some thought. So I think there's a couple things that people can do on an individual level. So like one little thing that I've thought of is that most people and most organizations like schools and groups like that use social media. And you probably post images on social media. And so one thing that you can do that just immediately sets things up for inclusion is if you post an image online, write a picture description. And there are ways that you can embed the picture description in the image as an alternative text element, or you can just write it, like literally just in the caption box, say picture description, and then it doesn't have to be fancy. It can just be a few words about what the picture is. So that way, someone who is blind or has low vision will know what the picture is, and someone who maybe has a visual processing disability will also know what the picture is, and they'll feel included and they'll feel like somebody wants them to interact with the content. So that's like one easy way. And then the other thing I would say is just a lot of what I talk about in the book is just involves having some patience. Like when I talk about the stop, ask, listen procedure, first step in that is stop. And so I think a lot of times we have these like knee jerk reactions where we want to jump in and we want to help, or we want to take control of a situation if someone's is acting in a way that's unexpected. We want to stop it right away, or we have these reactions. And I think part of getting closer to stage 5 is just taking a little pause to abort those reactions and to think about more harmonious ways to proceed, whether that's, if you see someone who appears that they need help, stop for a few seconds and think about, well, does this person really need help, or am I just making that assumption because I see a disability symbol on them, like they're in a wheelchair or they're using a cane? Or if someone is maybe has trouble answering a question, like you ask a student, you ask them a question and they don't answer immediately, because they need a little bit of processing time. It might mean just taking a few seconds, take a breath, count to 10, whatever, wait for the student to process what you've asked them instead of jumping in and, trying to answer for them or pressuring them to give an answer. Taking that time can really make a big difference.
Makes sense. And those are some really, really good tips. I know I've seen, for example, picture descriptions on social media more and more in the last couple of years, but definitely not enough. Like probably a very, very small minority of posts actually have those. So thank you for sharing that. Before I get to my next question, I also just want to encourage the audience members to put your comments and questions in the chat, and I will share them with Arielle as they pop up. In the meantime, do you have any tips or advice for how parents can best advocate for their children?
Yeah, that's such a broad question.
That's very broad.
Um, the first thing that comes to mind is I think the children's wishes need to be involved in every step of that process, and even kids who are young can articulate to varying degrees what their wishes are and what their priorities are. And of course, sometimes adults have to make decisions. But I mean, there certainly are grade school aged kids who attend their own IEP meetings along with their parents, and I always encourage that. Um, I think it's hard for parents to advocate when they don't themselves have the same disability as the child. And it's hard for parents to know what they should be advocating for because they might be hearing different things from different people, and some people might have titles or expertise, and but they might say things that don't feel right to the parent, and maybe other people don't have those titles, but they say something that feels a little more aligned with how the parent thinks things should go. I would definitely encourage parents to get to know as many adults as possible who have the same disability that their child has, um, whenever possible, and so they can get some feedback on whether the things that they're advocating for are actually what people with that disability generally want and need. And that can be used as kind of a metric to evaluate whether advice that they receive is advice that they actually want to follow. Um, those are the main things that come to mind.
Okay. Um, Especially I think too when the kids are really little and can't communicate with their parents and need sort of another voice. Great tips to find others with similar disabilities. Even though, like I like to quote Temple Grandin when she said, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. At least I think
Yeah,
that's
and there's always that caveat.
right. And also sticking with like staying in schools. I know a lot of the schools like to do these disability simulated exercises. I know my kids did them when they were in elementary school. And in the book, you said that they may build empathy, but empathy doesn't always correlate with inclusion and is more synonymous with pity and doesn't really capture what it's like being disabled. What would you say is a good alternative to these disability simulated activities? And what's the best way to teach about the disability experience?
So I think first of all, it's just important to remember that logically, there is literally no way to simulate losing something that you've had, um, and have that represent the experience of somebody who's never had that thing. So especially when you're talking about school-based activities and you're working with kids who have always had a disability since birth or very young, um, if you are a sighted adult, you might be able to simulate what it's like to suddenly and quickly go blind with some degree of accuracy. Not very good accuracy, but at least a little bit of accuracy. But you literally cannot simulate what it is like to have never had vision in your life. Because that would involve basically erasing your memory and losing all of your visual memories in addition to going blind. And when we're talking about like neurodivergence types of things like autism, it's even more complicated because just having someone do like a sensory overload simulation is like not even close to capturing the experience of somebody who's always been autistic, and has always had this certain profile. So in terms of alternatives, I think what you can simulate to some degree is learning how to use adaptive skills and adaptive technology. And of course, you can't necessarily in like 5 minutes learn how to use technology to the same degree as someone who's been using it for years. But exposure to adaptive technology or adaptive methods is a good way to just have a broader understanding of the types of adaptations that people make. So some examples of that might be having someone use a wheelchair and get some instruction in how to navigate kind of simple in simple ways in their chair, or maybe um, having folks close their eyes and then try to identify objects, but encouraging them to use their other senses and deliberately creating objects that vary to a large degree in their texture and their sounds and things like that. The other direction that activities can go in is simulating and replicating environmental barriers. So it's not necessarily helpful to have people feel empathy for someone because they have a disability. It is helpful to have people understand why environmental barriers are problematic. So that might involve having someone wheel around in an area that is accessible and then having them do it again in an area that's not, or vice versa, so that the environmental issue is really the front and center of the person's experience, and they can be like, whoa, I didn't realize that this setup is really hard for people in wheelchairs, and the only way I figured that out is by trying it both ways and being like, wow, I can get around so much easier when the ground is made accessible. I've also seen that done with websites, having like developers or programming students use a screen reader and try to use a website that is accessible and then try to use one that's not, and really think about what changes can be made to make the website accessible. And ultimately, the take home message should not be, oh, those poor disabled people, because that's not something that can be fixed necessarily. But the take home message can be, these barriers are really causing a lot of problems. Let's figure out how to fix them in the future.
I know when you first started answering this question, it really resonated with me because as a person with vision, obviously I have no idea. I can't even simulate what it would be to be blind. But there's a passage that I'd like to read that you wrote that really helped kind of capture the essence and give me the best understanding of your experience as a blind person. Um, you write, the word blind never bothered me any more than the word blonde. Both describe a visible characteristic of a person. Then you go on to say, for me, blindness has always felt as natural as breathing. I don't long for sight any more than somebody might long for the ability to fly, an invisibility cloak, x-ray vision, or the ability to read minds. So I thought that was really insightful for me to kind of get a sense of your experiences. So I just wanted to share that. And then we also have a bunch of comments and questions in the chat. I'll start with Margot, who said, thank you, Dr. Silverman, for your thoughtful discussion. I loved your book, and I was wondering if you could further explain people's reaction in overpraising your efforts because you were blind.
Sure. So I would say when it was most apparent when I was a preteen, or well, it happened when I was a young child, but I wasn't necessarily aware of why it was problematic. And then it continued through being a preteen and being a teen when I started to recognize and not like what was happening. Sometimes I would do things that were ordinary, or even so I give an example in the book about trying to shoot an arrow in archery class, and which is not something that I'm good at. And a teacher was helping me, and with her help, I hit a bullseye. But it was very obvious to me that I had really not done it. It was the teacher. And so people started praising me, and it felt really inauthentic because I knew that I had not done it. But another example might be, or an example from my adulthood might be, that I might walk one block down the street to a familiar street corner and not even think anything of it. It's something I do all the time, cross the street, and then somebody on the other side of the curb says, wow, good job. And I write it in the book about how, for example, when we praise children, which is and although there's some debate even in that case, how much we should be praising young children for doing ordinary things. But in some ways, praising children is more acceptable because the children will eventually kind of progress, and achievements that are genuinely a big deal the first time a child does something are, treated as more ordinary as the child masters that skill, and they're no longer being overpraised for that. But I would still be overpraised for things that I had done over and over and over and that had become automatic. And that, so the implicit message that's communicated when someone praises me, and sometimes it would be very obvious because my sister or my peer who did the exact same thing would not get the same reaction. And sometimes I could even see it. And not only would that create jealousy and resentment for the other person at times, understandably so, but then it would also make me wonder, why are they making such a big deal about me doing it? So the implicit message usually is, that's a great job for a blind person, which is not something that anyone really wants to hear or be a part of. And I would say that now as an adult, I probably don't get it quite as much, but I still have those strangers when I'm crossing the street, or there's one time I was at in the airport and I needed to use the bathroom, and I got up and I went to the bathroom, and then I came back to my gate and the guy said, "Wow, that was awesome." And I was thinking, well, did you want me to just sit there and pee my pants? Because that was the alternative, and I didn't want to do that. So I got up and did what I had to do. Um, and so yeah, it just came across, and of course it was very well intended, I'm sure, but it came across to me as, well, you wouldn't say that to a random sighted woman who gets up and goes to the bathroom and comes back to the gate. So you must believe that I'm less capable of engaging in that task.
Right. Wow. I'm sure you've gotten a lot of comments that are insensitive but well-meaning. We've got a lot of questions in the chat popping up. So one of them is, were there any particular challenges that you had in accessing Jewish studies, Hebrew school, for example? And did you have a bat mitzvah? And if so, can you tell us about all that?
Yeah, so I had kind of a unique situation because in some ways, perhaps because my parents were close friends with the rabbi and the cantor at my synagogue. And so I'm sure that afforded me some privileges that other disabled young people might not have. I did have a bat mitzvah, and I did have very good access in Hebrew school. There is an organization called the Jewish Braille Institute in New York that prepared Braille copies of my prayer books and all the materials that I needed for my bat mitzvah. And I was able to go to services on Shabbat and on high holidays and have full access to what was in the Siddur. There is a Hebrew Braille alphabet. It's actually a lot easier to learn than the Hebrew print alphabet. There's a lot more similarity to the English alphabet in Braille than in print. So I was able to learn it very quickly. And in Hebrew school, I would have these books that JBI sent. And so I imagine my parents had to send the books away to be transcribed, but I don't think they had to pay for it. I don't know. And then there was usually, like, in every class in the Hebrew school, they would have a madrich or a madricha, which is like a high school student who would act as an assistant for the entire class. And that person was usually assigned to work with me one-on-one if there were any activities that were not accessible, or, worksheets being passed out that weren't brailled, and things like that. So during my bat mitzvah, I had all the materials in Braille. My Torah portion was in a booklet in Braille, and then my dad came up and pointed the pointer for me while on the Torah scroll while I was reading. So that was the only real adaptation that needed to be made.
So it sounds like your congregation did a really good job of making things accessible for you.
Yeah.
Good. And I know you do a lot of consulting. So when you're asked to advise a school or a congregation or a camp on how to make the transformation to better inclusivity, what are some of the general tips or advice that you give them?
So I talk a lot about promoting self-advocacy and listening to, campers and their parents, and what specific needs they communicate that they have, and encouraging campers to educate their peers. Um, making accommodations that are like this stage 5 concept of making accommodations that improve things for everyone and not just for one person. So sometimes you can have counselors or additional staff who can come in and maybe support certain individuals who have more support needs, but they can also help everyone. And that ends up being less stigmatizing for those individuals. So I talk about that a lot. Um, Having someone evaluate the physical accessibility of the camp facilities. And I know, of course, sometimes camps are located in these kinds of older facilities that aren't necessarily accessible, and sometimes there's a limit on what can be modified. I think another big one is just providing a choice of activities during the day so that people who might not be able to access certain activities like still have something to do. So I definitely have some trauma from childhood. First of all, I was not allowed to attend my Jewish summer camp in the 90s. I was just not permitted to attend. And of course, I don't know. I was a kid. I don't know exactly what the back and forth was around that, but there seemed to be a perception that I would require a lot of one-on-one support that was not available or that would have cost too much, which I don't think was actually true. I think there were definitely ways that I could have been accommodated that would have been less um, of a hardship for the camp. But I also have some memories of like sporting activities where I wasn't allowed to participate and there was no alternative provided. So I would just like sit on a bench and wait for my friends to finish playing these games and things like that. And that was definitely traumatic. So I think having like always having 2 or more activities so that a child can choose the one that they have the most access to and that they have the most interest in. Um, Also maybe having some kind of quiet space so that people and of course for people with like sensory processing differences is the obvious target for that, but sometimes everyone needs a quiet space at some point. So creating like that kind of space so that folks can decompress and have that kind of neurological break when they sensory break when they need it is another idea that can be implemented pretty much across the board.
And I'm thinking of all these things that you've said and making a mental checklist. And thankfully, all those things have been done at my son's overnight camp. So
Right.
glad to hear that they are on the right track and following all those great tips already. We have a couple questions, like a 2-part question from Naomi. She wants to know, how would you encourage children to reach out to their disabled classmates? And then how would you encourage children to reach out effectively and respectfully? I guess she just updated her question. So how would you encourage children to reach out effectively and respectfully to their disabled classmates?
So I always say in my trainings that one of the key principles of disability wisdom is treating the disabled person like an ordinary person. And so that really means that in, I would say at least 95% of the time, you can interact with a peer who has a disability in exactly the same way that you would interact with somebody who does not. And so however for that particular child and their personality and what they're comfortable with, however they would interact with their peers without disabilities, they should do that with their peers with disabilities. And people also talk about presuming competence, which basically means that if you're not sure how to treat someone, you should just assume that you should treat them the same way as anyone else. And you should assume that someone will understand what you're saying. If you're not sure if they'll understand or not, you should assume that they will. And then if they don't understand, that will become apparent. But it's better to assume they will understand and be wrong than to assume that they won't understand and talk down to them. So I think in the general case, I would say interact the same way that you would interact with anybody else. And of course, there's going to be some exceptions to that, right? So if someone comes up to me and smiles at me, I'm not going to get it. And if that's how they interact with most people, that's kind of their general operating procedure. Coming up to me and smiling or making a face or whatever is not going to help. So that might be an exception to the rule where it would be better instead of smiling to come up and say hello. But it's also not necessary to come up and say hello to me if you wouldn't do that with other people. So it's not necessary to reach out more assertively to the person with a disability than you would with anyone else. And I, in many cases, I would rather someone forget that I have a disability and treat me the same way as anyone else than over focus on it. Um, Sometimes that flips a little bit when you're thinking about invisible disabilities because people do have a bias toward denying invisible disabilities and kind of assuming that people are faking or that they don't really need the accommodations. And that's where it's really critical to listen to the person and to find out what they need, what they want. And if someone says, I need to sit down because I have some kind of physical issue where I can't stand for a long period of time, you should believe them and give them that accommodation. So I hope that answers the question.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm totally going to switch gears here and ask you about your husband and how you guys met. Can you share with us the love story there?
Well, it's in the book, so I don't want to overshare.
Okay.
I think the Cliff Notes version is that I had a couple of partners, and I had some partners who were blind, and my husband is sighted, and I didn't necessarily seek out a blind partner or a sighted partner. I mean, I wanted to marry whomever I was most compatible with, who I loved. I did write about there was a time when I was in college when I thought it would be pretty unlikely that I would end up marrying a sighted person, and not necessarily out of reverse ableism, although I think there was a little bit of that going on. But mainly just because I felt like we wouldn't have a connection because I was doing so much of this disability stuff. And I did meet my husband as a graduate student. We were in the same class, so that's the short answer to the question. But by the end of it, I think that I came to the conclusion that it really doesn't matter if your partner has a disability or not. There's dynamics either way that have to be worked through. But the most important thing is that you love the person, you feel, that's where I wrote about in whose embrace you feel completely secure. I mean, he's the only person who can hold me and I feel, 100% safe and secure. Um, so I think the main point of that is there's certainly merit in couples getting together where both people have disabilities. There's also merit in couples getting together where one person has a disability and the other one does not. And the main thing is just ensuring compatibility and trust and love. And the rest of it's in chapter 11. So read chapter 11.
Okay. And on that note, I also wanted to say that Arielle's book is available on Amazon in Kindle format and also in print, but also at the JCC during the book fair event. If anybody wants to stop by and grab it there. And I think it might even be sold for less than on Amazon. But again, purchase it in the book fair lobby of the JCC or online. And then Arielle, I also wanted to ask you what what you studied in grad school. What's your degree in?
So I have a doctorate in social psychology, which can be thought of as intermediate between psychology and sociology. So I studied the psychology of group behavior, intergroup behavior, how people think about other people and other groups. Um, Also got a lot of background in quantitative research methods. And I was going to make just a quick comment about the book. I do have some alternate formats for sale if anyone is interested in getting it as a PDF download or as a synthetic audio file. You can purchase it by sending me Venmo or PayPal, and all the details are on my website at disabilitywisdom.com. I am also working on recording a human self-narrated audio version that will be out in December through my website.
Great, thanks for sharing that. Um, speaking of your education, I wanted to just backtrack to, you had mentioned a little bit earlier, your experience, well, that you went to Louisiana Center for the Blind. And it sounds like when you were there that you gained a lot of confidence, and that's sort of where you learned to trust yourself. My takeaway from your experiences there is that it's okay to let our kids fail, that it's the best way for them to learn. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that? And maybe you're in the context of failure. And I don't even know if you want to share the cooking episode that you talk about in the book where you accidentally used green food coloring instead of vanilla, or is that a spoiler alert that we should save for the book?
Yeah, it's a minor spoiler alert, but that's not a huge part of the storyline.
Yeah, but it really
So this is
about letting our kids, that it's okay
right.
for kids to fail, that that's really their best way to learn.
So this is covered in chapter 12, and before I went to the Louisiana Center for the Blind, I had received a lot of training in, I mean, I was reading Braille by the time I was 5, and I was using a cane, and I was using computers. And so some people might wonder, like, why would I take 7 months out of my life to go to a training center? And the one thing that I had not learned through all that training was how to fail and how to learn from my mistakes. Because many of the people who taught me growing up would teach me in such a scaffolded way that I couldn't fail, or if I did fail, it was seen as kind of an more of an ultimate failure, like I couldn't recover from it. Particularly the way that people taught blind people how to navigate in space and travel. I was taught that I needed to memorize these exact directions to get from one place to another, which is just not realistic because things change and there's construction and roads are closed, or something happens to the intersection that you're crossing, or you're just having a bad day and you get turned around. So when I was at the center, in every class that I attended, I was encouraged to fail and struggle, but I was also given the structure and the scaffolding that I needed to recover from that. And so there were a couple of times when I accidentally grabbed the wrong ingredient for cooking, or I went to the wrong place and I was on a orientation and mobility lesson, or I was building something in the wood shop that went horribly wrong. And when I was done with doing all that, I noticed that when I left the center and came back to civilization, if I was going somewhere and I got turned around, I could recognize it and I could problem solve it a lot quicker than I could before. Or if I was cooking and something happened in the kitchen, it didn't rattle me the way that it had before. So I do think it is really important to give kids opportunities to try and to fail. And that sometimes when you're a kid or you're a teenager, you don't know what you're capable of until you try something. If somebody else has always been doing something for you, you might not even be aware that it's possible to do that thing on your own until you try it.
And I think a lot of parents and teachers do that. They don't want to see the kids fail. I know that I've been guilty of that myself. And like you said, it really is a good way for anybody really to learn. I want to switch gears and ask about employment barriers. What employment barriers are faced by those with disabilities, and how do we overcome them?
There are so many of them. I would say the main categories of barriers are attitudinal barriers. So employers just don't understand that employees with disabilities can benefit them, or they don't know how people with disabilities do things. I mean, there's research that showed that like a very large percentage of employers didn't know the basics of how a blind person uses a computer. And that's not necessarily their fault. It just means that there hasn't been enough education about that kind of stuff. Or employers think that accommodations would cost too much, or they're afraid that they'll get sued if something happens. Like if they hire the disabled person and they have to fire them for some other reason, they're afraid they'll get a disability lawsuit. There's all kinds of fears and misconceptions. Another huge class of barriers relates to how employment systems are set up. So the technology that's used on the job excludes a lot of people. In my new job, I just worked on a big research study that found that like more than half of blind employees said they had trouble filling out forms they needed for onboarding, for example, because they weren't accessible. So all kinds of incompatibilities between the employment technology and assistive technology that people use, or the workplaces themselves aren't physically accessible. Transportation, or lack thereof, is a huge problem that hopefully like telework will help us start to overcome to some extent. And then I think there's inherent um, barriers related to working itself in terms of people with health disabilities and people with cognitive disabilities who have the lowest employment rates among all the disability categories. Um, the way that employment is constructed often requires long hours, and for people with certain health conditions, that's just really hard. Or having to work set like the same hours every day, um, without being able to take breaks, or just the cognitive demands of, or social demands, or communication demands of working in a traditional job can be really hard for some people to succeed in that environment. And even just like the whole job seeking landscape is very challenging for anyone. And then if you have a disability that affects your processing or your stamina, it makes it even harder.
Where are you working now? Can you share that with us?
Yeah, so I started a new job after I finished writing the book around the time it was published. I work for the American Foundation for the Blind full time as their director of research.
And then just one other quick follow-up question about employment. Do you think that every person with a disability can hold a job? And if so, can you explain what that might look like, particularly for those who are most severely impacted by their disability? Or is that too broad of a question?
So I do not think that in the current labor market the way it is, unfortunately, I do not think every single person can hold a job, or at least not a job that fits their capabilities. There are going to be some people who are underqualified and some people who are overqualified, and there are going to be some people who don't fit anywhere. That's sad but true. I do, however, believe that, and I say this in the book, and I think it's a pretty bold statement, but I do believe that every single person is capable of doing something that benefits another person besides themselves. And some of the things that people might do might not be monetizable, but I do think that every single person is capable of doing something, and we can call it work or we can call it something else, um, that benefits another person or group of people besides themselves, even if that's just providing affection to, reciprocating the affection of a caregiver, for example, and giving that caregiver meaning in their work. Um, but a lot of times, I think people have passions, or they have interests, or even stims or behaviors or whatever you want to call it, that could be, if they're appropriately directed, could be jobs, or they could somehow be useful in benefiting others, even if if they're not monetizable. And so maybe if we were more creative in figuring out how to harness all that energy that people have that put into certain passions, things that they do repeatedly throughout the day, and figure out how to make those things useful to other people, we could really much more efficiently utilize the energy and the skills of people with disabilities.
Speaking of stimming, you talk about it in the book, including your own behavior of pushing on your eyes. Can you share your thoughts on how parents and educators could respond to a child's stimming?
So I think there's a balance here, and my attitudes have changed over the last few years and probably will continue to evolve over time. I do think there's a balance, because I think in a perfect world, and this is a little bit parallel to the last question, right? So in a perfect world, every person with a disability could do something employment wise, and everyone should be free to stim however they want without any fear of negative consequences. Um, there are some stims, like my eye pressing, that do have medical implications, and those medical implications often tend to be exaggerated. If you think about kids running around, nobody really worries about the child who's active and runs around a lot, but they could get hurt that way, right? They could fall and break their arm or break their leg. A lot of stims that people get really bent out of shape about are a lot safer than some of those neurotypical behaviors that kids might engage in. So I think the medical implications of stims are exaggerated, but I think there are some stims that certainly do have legitimate medical implications that need to be factored in. I don't think that expecting someone like me to never eye press ever is realistic, because the drive is neurologically based and there's a lot of reasons why people have a hard time 100% not doing it ever. I do think it is useful to help people like me, and I'm grateful that for the intervention that I did get, to cut down on the frequency of the behavior so that the medical implications are not as strong. I also recognize that we live in an ableist world where there are legitimately negative consequences for stimming in public. And so I do think there's a balance, because I think kids do need to be aware of the fact that other people might react negatively when they stim. But I also think that, again, the messaging tends to get exaggerated. I think kids will pick up on, even kids who are blind, who can't see the reactions of others, will pick up pretty quickly on how others react to their stims, and it doesn't need to be beaten to death, that message, by parents and teachers. I think it's okay to occasionally talk about it, but it doesn't need to become this big thing, because kids will figure it out. They know that others treat them differently when they stim. I think when parents and teachers do intervene, it's important to present alternatives and to incorporate those into an overall education for kids about their bodies and what their bodies are capable of, and all the different ways that they can express their emotions or their sensory needs using their bodies, and some of those ways might be safer than others, or socially safer than others. And then kids can decide, depending on what setting they're in, what kinds of stims they want to use.
So do you think providing something like a fidget toy is a good alternative, or not necessarily?
I think it has potential. I don't personally use fidget toys, so I can't speak to their value personally, but from what I've heard from others, um, I don't think there's anything wrong with providing a more discreet method of stimming and then encouraging someone to use that method. I don't think it's right to force or punish or shame someone into using that method, but certainly presenting that method and explaining why it might be better to use that method in certain situations is good.
All right, and then I have one final question for the night, and that is, if everybody here in the audience wakes up tomorrow and does one thing that's new or different as a first step toward making the world a more respectful and inclusive place, what would you want to see everybody do?
Well, I think I already answered that question, because I talked about the social media descriptions, and I talked about being patient, which I think is applicable in a lot of different settings. I think just recognizing that we don't know another person's whole story. So when we start to get annoyed or frustrated with another person, which, believe me, I do a lot, um, it's important to take that step back and to think, well, maybe that person isn't intentionally trying to cause me strife. Maybe that person has a struggle that's invisible to me, that I don't know about. And I think my book presents this tension between acceptance and change. So on the one-on-one level, I would challenge everyone to think about how to be more accepting of ourselves and of the people around us. But on the systemic level, we really need to start thinking about what systems should be changed and how we can work toward changing those systems. So it might be a matter of joining an advocacy organization or donating to an advocacy organization that's working to change policies, or maybe talking to someone in your workplace if you notice that your office has an accessibility limitation, like you work in a place that's not wheelchair accessible, or you notice something about the technology that your workplace uses or something like that. Might be speaking up on that level, or joining an advocacy organization. And then individually, it's just a matter of being more patient, more accepting, and respectful of each other.
Great. Thank you. I feel like you've given us a lot of really good tips and advice and things that, that can be easily done. And then also some things that require a little bit more thinking and planning. And these are really good first steps for people who need to take first steps. And I know that there's a lot of organizations and schools in our community that are already taking many great steps and beyond. So Arielle, thank you so much for being here tonight. I also want to thank everybody for coming. Again, we had already mentioned that Arielle's book is available on Amazon. It's available at the J during the book fair. And also the alternative digital format is available on her website, which again is disabilitywisdom.com. You'll also find on the website more information about Arielle, including her blog. And at this point, I would just like to turn things over to Ellen for some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Arielle and Jennifer, for being with us for such a wonderful discussion. And Emily Kimmel-Kurtz for being our ASL interpreter. You all did an exceptional job and gave us so many thoughtful and inspiring thoughts to think about. I also want to thank all of you at home for joining us. You may complete the evaluation forms that we put in the chat. Our next Opening the Doors event is the Anita Naphtali Family Circle Conference on Sunday, November 20th at 7 p.m. For more information about this event, please go to openingthedoors@jccdet.org. Our next book fair event is tomorrow evening, Thursday, November 3rd at 7 p.m. for an in-person presentation at the J with author Michael Oren, speaking about his latest novel, Swan's War. Remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website, jccdet.org/bookfair, for our full schedule and ways to get involved. See you next time, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Bye-bye.